Alright, so I noticed that a lot of Grail players dropped out of high school or were vaping too many mango jewel pods in the school bathroom because none of you blockheads know how to use ratios. Let's get straight to the point. Here's the formula you use to calculate your sellables to tro.
What the hell?
Bro, you don't even know what a summative is? It's time you hop off that galaxy gas and pick up a book, bozo. So I've simplified this formula for you in Fortnite terms with tables of relevant sellable prices. Let's do a quick example calculation and later I'll explain the math behind them. Let's say you have 400 papers, 200 tires, and 30 red mushrooms. You'll take all of those numbers and multiply them by their respective gralat worth. So papers is 4, tires is 6, and mushrooms is 5. Now, we add all of the gralats together and divide them by the ratio of gralats to tro, which is currently 3.5 to 1. So we divide by 3.5. And voila, we get the number of tro we need. And I always like rounding up. If you still can't use this formula, God Almighty himself can't even save you. You're better off checking the shop tab and reconsidering your options here. But for real, you can buy gralats here with real money if you really need to. I recommend watching the rest of the video because I'll explain why this formula works. But be prepared, I am entering my teacher mode. If you're going to manually solve this using a calculator, be sure to use PEMDAS. Please excuse my dope ass swag. Nah, but for real, solve parentheses first, exponents, multiplication, division, and lastly, addition and subtraction. First, we need to explain units. So here's a quick algebra lesson on unit addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, which is directly related to sellables and tro. In algebra, a variable is just a symbol that represents a quantity of something. That is why you see fancy stuff like x, y, z, or theta for angles, or lambda for like wavelengths. They just represent something. Some variables have units, which are standardized measures used to quantify and express specific amounts of a given quantity. So here, the variable y has a quantity of 10 with unit pounds, also known as 10 pounds. In our case, we are dealing with the variables p1, P2, B, T, with units paper 1, paper 2, bottles, and tires. The addition and subtraction rules that units obey are the following. If we were to add 3 bottles with 2 bottles, we would get 5 bottles. Notice how the units of the bottles remains just bottles and not bottles squared or something like that. Algebraically, the addition case would look like B sub A with units bottles plus B sub B with units bottles that equals B sub C with unit bottles. The same rules apply to subtraction. Graal automatically adds units that are alike for us in our inventory, but notice in our formula, the papers, bottles, and tires are all separate from each other. This is because the gralat value of each trash is different, except the papers, but I'll get to that in a little bit. Here I show the other rule of why we can't add variables together that have different units. For example, we can't add 1 bottle plus 1 tire because what would that equal? These units are not the same, so we'd get some weird imaginary units called bottle tire. Like, what the heck is that? In rare cases, we can define these units and just call it trash. But many times in algebra, this is not possible, and what ends up happening is that we just get some weird units that don't mean anything to us. That is why in algebra, we can't add variables that are not the same. This is also why in our formula to calculate the tro, we have separated the trash into its components of P1, P2, B, and T. This formula can technically be simplified because papers 1 and 2 are equal to each other in value. Both the papers sell for 4 gralats, so they're equivalent in terms of value. This means we can do something called factoring, where we take both of these g's and pull them outside of the equation to get the following. Now we can add papers 1 and 2 together to get the total papers. And the units work out because of the values that we've given all of these definitions. This simplifies our formula to this. Now we get into ratios. A ratio compares a property of 2 quantities. In our case, we have the quantity of trash being compared to the quantity of gralat. A ratio can also be represented as a fraction, where if we had a ratio of 6 gralats to 1 tire, the fraction would be 6 gralats divided by 1 tire, or 1 tire divided by 6 gralats. These fractions are clearly not equivalent, but they represent the same ratio. Here we learn that ratios can be expressed in fractions, but are not directly equivalent to fractions in math terms. In order to know which fraction to use in our formula, we need to look at the units. For example, if we had 46 tires, we would need to multiply the tires by 6 divided by 1, not the 1 divided by 6, because after multiplication, we get units of gralats as compared to tires squared divided by gralats. Like, what the heck is this? Algebraically, the multiplication and division of units operates very similar to variables, where t times t is equal to t squared. For division, the variables t divided by t is equal to 1, but the units disappear. This is because they cancel each other out. So we have covered that units operate very differently than variables for addition and subtraction. But for multiplication and division, they act very similar to variables. Alright, so back to our formula. I'll plug in some values for the trash amounts and include their units. Then I will apply their respective gralats amounts. After doing all of this math, see how we're left with just gralats. So we found the total gralat worth of all of our trash. And now we need to use another ratio to convert the gralats to tro. The ratio is currently 3.5 gralats to 1 tro. We could use the fraction of 1 tro divided by 3.5 gralats or 3.5 gralats divided by 1 tro. I say pause the video and try to see which fraction we need to use. Okay. In this case, because I set up the formula to be division, we need to use the 3.5 gralats divided by 1 tro. This is because of how units work with division. If you have g divided by t, you can solve the equation by taking the reciprocal and multiplying it by the numerator. We see that g divided by g is equal to 1, and therefore we're just left with t. In our case, t is our tro. Similarly, we could have used the multiplication formula you see here to then use the other fraction. That would just give you the same answer. It doesn't matter how you set up the equation, it just has to be set up correctly. Covering these units has been super important for us because you could set up any formula you want as long as the units are correct. And we see here that they are. Summarizing what we know about ratios, we know that we can use ratios to go from one unit to another unit by multiplication or division. You can apply this to many places of your life, like if you drove 50 kilometers per hour for 3 hours, you would know that you traveled 150 kilometers. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed your free math session with Goobear, and our next lesson will be an intro to quantum mechanics.